Hello and welcome to History For Weirdos.
We're your hosts, Andrew
and Stephanie,
and each week we're going to take you on a journey into the strange, obscure, and relentlessly entertaining corners of human history.
Now listen up, friends, because it's about to get weird. Well, weirdos, we are so excited to introduce a very special guest that we know you all are going to love. We have Dr. Helen Fry here. She has authored and edited over 25 books covering the social history of the Second World War, including British intelligence and the Secret War, espionage, and spies. She's the foremost authority on the secret listeners who worked at special eavesdropping sites operated by British intelligence during World War II. Her groundbreaking research and extensive media coverage have shed light on the greatest intelligence deceptions of the war. The bugging of Hitler's generals at Trent Park in North London, and thousands of prisoners of war at Latimer House and Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire. I'm sure I mispronounced that, so I apologize. But her latest book is out now, really exciting. It's called Why I Became an Ex-Troop Commando, A Life of Colin Anson, the German who fought for Churchill, which is amazing. Congratulations and welcome, Dr. Fry.
Thank you. It's great to be on your podcast, and hello to everyone listening.
They are going to be so excited. Andrew and I were discussing this because we call our listeners weirdos very affectionately, and they love World War II, espionage, and anything to do with representing women in history. And you are an expert in all three.
Thank you. I hadn't realised that was the case, but thank you for that accolade.
Yeah, it seems like this is the perfect intersection for our podcast because we really like to highlight people that aren't given their due in history. And it seems when we talk about World War II, there's certain subjects that are always covered. I mean, Hitler ad nauseum is always covered, and especially the Western Front and the march towards Berlin is always covered, D-Day. But these are the people that really that worked behind the scenes. It seems like that's your specialty. The people who weren't really talked about, the spies that really helped win the war on kind of like an emerging front that wasn't exactly physical, that wasn't firing guns or launching bombs at each other. It's the behind the scenes work that helped us gather intelligence to win World War II, which is I think incredible and endlessly fascinating.
It is, and I love this subject. I mean, I fell into it quite accidentally. I was researching 10,000 actually Germans who fought for Britain in the Second World War, and you have an equivalent story of around 14,000 Germans, and it includes Austrians, who fought for America. And the vast majority of them, 90% of them, were Jewish. They had to flee Nazi Germany and occupied or annexed Austria. And in Britain and America, they played their part in our armed forces across all aspects of the war in extraordinary operations. And because of their fluency in German and other languages in some cases, they were taken up very quickly in some cases, and in others it was 2 or 3 years into the war, but they were taken up for some of the most top secret intelligence missions that have remained classified, that is not released to the public, for over 70 years. And I've been working on some of those files and bringing those stories to light, and it's utterly fascinating.
That is so cool. Is that research included in your most recent book that just came out?
Yes, so I interviewed Colin Anson, a long time ago now, over 20 years ago. And an early version of his biography came out, but it's been out of print. And so my publisher, Yale University Press, big shout out for Yale. They are fabulous. They are in New Haven in America and London here in the UK. Fabulous publisher. Has published a lot of my espionage work and intelligence research. But also they said, look, some of these stories you've done in the past, they need to be brought to a new generation. And they were inspired by Colin's story. Colin, the German refugee who came, he had a Jewish father, Protestant mother, who came from Berlin, and in the end ended up being in the most elite part of the British Army, i.e. in those commandos, in the ungentlemanly warfare that obviously was part of some of the successes behind enemy lines.
That's incredible. I have maybe a silly question. Why is it referred to as ungentlemanly warfare?
Ungentlemanly because it was unorthodox. So there's very
Okay.
traditional ways of training in the British Army, and it's probably true in the American Army. I mean, there are equivalent ungentlemanly
Yeah.
warfare carried out by various secret parts of American armed forces,
Yeah.
disrupting the Nazi war machine. If we're talking about World War II,
Hmm.
disrupting the Nazi war machine, behind enemy lines, communications, blowing up trains, dropping in agents, whatever it is. And in respect to the commandos, they were special forces. So they had
Okay.
tough elite training. I suppose you would parallel them with special forces in America today, like your Navy SEALs.
Hmm.
They're similar to the Royal Marine Commandos here. And they had training that wasn't offered elsewhere in the British Army. So they
Mm.
would be training in some of the most difficult parts of the UK. We have some pretty remote places, Scotland being right up the top of the UK, being one of them in the mountains, and they are abseiling, they're crossing torrents, really fast flowing rivers with just a rope, and also involved in scaling sheer cliff faces. I mean, everything you think of when you think of
Hmm.
those special forces. The training was tough. I mean, they would have a minimum of an 8 kilometre jog with full kit on before breakfast. So that's before they've even
Oh my
eaten
gosh.
anything, early in the morning. And then, of course, a full day of training. So that's why it was unorthodox, ungentlemanly, because some parts,
Okay.
of course, were involved in the whole gung ho of blowing up things. Colin wasn't on the gung ho side, but yeah, that's some of what was going on.
Oh my gosh. So, Helen, if we take a step back here, it seems like you have a wide and deep knowledge of World War II and especially behind the scenes. What got you started in this like long journey? What kind of was that spark that really just made you decide, I'm going to go research like the spy and espionage portion of World War II?
Well, it was part of a journey, and I think it's accidental. My publisher thinks differently. My publisher thinks, it's the way I research, the way I just sort of work, the way my brain or detective work goes, that my finds aren't accidental in a way. So we'll agree to
Hmm.
differ on that in a polite way. That's fine. I'm having a bit of fun with my publisher there. But yeah, it started about 25, 30 years ago. And I've always loved history, all kinds of history, but particularly the Second World War. We weren't taught very much of it at school because it was still, within about 40 years of living history. Within that period, you don't tend to learn at school the immediate history of the last 20, 30, 40 years. And also so much has still been held back. When I learned the little bit I did about World War II, I thought that was all there was we could ever know about World War II. But in the last, 50 years, so many files have been declassified. So I started to tell the stories of 10,000 Germans who fought for Britain in that war. Many of them
Hmm.
lived in northwest London. They'd never told their stories. They were quite reluctant to tell their stories, and it took several years to gain confidence, friendship, that naturally occurred. And eventually, when they get further into telling their war, when they're comfortable, because don't forget they've had a lot of trauma in their past. Most of them had lost family in the concentration camps, and they'd lost comrades on the battlefield. So they'd got a lot of trauma, and they'd fled the country of their birth. So by the time I get to it, they tell me the stories they want to tell me. And then I discovered so many of them went into the intelligence work because of the language. And whether that was behind
Mm-hmm.
enemy lines or in secret sites still within the UK, I was fascinated. And I promised various veterans that I would get to tell those stories. And then once I fell into this intelligence history, those whole mysterious, shadowy world of spies, I was hooked. And now I'm telling the broader stories of espionage, including the women. And I don't think I'm coming out of that hole yet for a while. I love it.
I mean, it sounds like an amazing place to be. It's obviously history, but it almost sounds like fiction, right? It's so incredible and just awe-inspiring that it's
Mhm.
it's wild to think these are real stories. Where do the women come into play? Because I imagine they're not a part of those 10,000 that you referenced.
Actually, there were around 1,000 of those 10,000 were women. Theirs were
Oh, that's
harder
awesome.
to tell. It was harder to tell their stories way back 20 years ago. I put a call out in various journals and various organisations where the former
Hmm.
refugees would be part of a group or an association, and I only got a couple of responses from the women. And that was because they were humble about their war. Even the men were humble about their war and didn't think they'd been particularly brave. And you soon find that's not the case. They've been in the most dangerous situations. But the women, even more so, they thought, they would just had an ordinary war. So those that I did manage to speak to started off, yes, in an ordinary way. They might have been helping in the NAFI tent. They might have been doing some basic work. But very
Hmm.
soon, again, because of the language, a lot of them are doing intelligence work. But they didn't see it as important because, well, not that the work itself wasn't important, but they weren't given the overall picture of how their work helped the wider war effort. They signed the Official Secrets Act, could never talk about it, and therefore had no sense of how this fitted into the war because those secret files were classified until only fairly recently. But it is fascinating. They did play their part, and I'm sad that I didn't get to interview more of them, but it was primarily because they didn't think they'd really contributed. And of course, that
Mm.
was so far from the case. They absolutely had.
Mm. That sounds like an impression that real heroes would have about themselves, right? Kind of being very humble about their efforts and their contributions.
Yeah, and I call the introduction in Colin's book, on the ex-troop commando book, I am no hero, because that's what he said to me. I'm not a hero.
Mm.
He didn't want his book to be written to start with. Who's going to read it? Why would anyone want to read this? And I said, well, it is a really extraordinary war that you've had. Not least, he's involved in the landings on Sicily in July 1943 alongside American troops and special forces. And to cut a long story short, basically, after about a week or so, he gets hit. His ship is hit when they're back on the ship, waiting to do another special operation and land again behind enemy lines. And he's hit. Half of his brain is exposed. He has an operation in a field hospital and he dies on the operating theatre. And they kind of massage his heart for half an hour. He only finds out this later. And it's unbelievable. They actually did. He underwent brain surgery in a field tent with Canadian nurses that looked after him. He was then transferred to Egypt, to Cairo, and 9 months of recuperation, including bone grafts and all kinds of things, because, his brain was still a little bit exposed in places. And, you know, he had that view, I want to still fight. And he's recovering from a brain operation, but he wants to go back. and he wants to go back, he says, to his brothers in arms. And
Wow.
the commanding officer looking after that camp says, well, you've done your bit. He'd done a lot behind enemy lines. You've done your bit. We'll give you a nice desk job in London. And he says, I'm not having a desk job. I want to go back. And he made sure he was fighting fit. And he went behind enemy lines again into Yugoslavia, Albania, and he was involved in the liberation of the Greek island of Corfu. Incredible man. And a man with a deep, as people see if you read the book, a deep moral compass when he comes to crossroads at various points when he could have made a decision. In one case, whether or not to take out, he was back in post-war Germany, in British Army uniform, whether to take out the man who betrayed his father to Dachau concentration camp. That was back in 1937. What did he do? That super fit commando. They'd have gone for a walk in the woods and only one of them would have come back. So I'll leave you to read the book as to what actually happens. But he was incredible. And then one day I said to him, look, forget all this about hero. Okay, we won't say anything about being a hero, we won't discuss whether you're a hero or not. But I think it's important that future generations understand what we fought for, the sacrifice. Oh, all right, then, he said, if you think people will read my story, but I'm not a hero. No, you're not a hero. We agreed that, okay, he's not a hero. But he wasn't the only one. I've interviewed a couple of veterans now who are over 100, and they don't see themselves as heroes. And they were flying Spitfires, or they were going behind enemy lines. They are a very special generation. And I interviewed, in my career, I was lucky to interview a few American veterans, exactly the same. They had a very difficult war. They sacrificed, put their lives on the line, and they still did not see themselves as heroes. So a very special generation.
It sounds like it. I mean, and also if they're not heroes, I mean, who are the heroes?
Exactly. I think it's funny, isn't it? They're so humble, and they don't like the term hero. They're not brave. They just did what they had to do. And I learned to accept that, actually, not to impose the word hero on them. But so many of them have passed now, and well, maybe we can posthumously give them the title of heroes.
Yeah. Oh, that's too funny. And Helen, when you're kind of evaluating these stories and you're investigating them and you're finding all of these people who are, quote unquote, not heroes, are there? Colin seems to be an obvious standout choice. I mean, you wrote your latest book is on him. Are there any other folks that you've come across that really kind of tug at your heartstrings as well?
Oh, so many of them. I mean, in the women's book, that's extraordinary. That came out in paperback just this year, a few months ago. And that's called Women in Intelligence, The Hidden History of Two World Wars. So then I go back to the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and then the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. And the roles of the women were invisible, whether it was behind enemy lines or collecting intelligence, whether they were dropped as agents, or whether they were code breaking at a secret site in the UK. They did things outside the boundaries of what we usually think of women doing in intelligence roles. They had the title of secretary or clerk, but they most certainly were not. Some of them were running spy networks across Europe, but everyone just assumed she was a secretary. She's just in an office doing this, but they had no idea. So uncovering that secret world. And one in particular, now I can't just pick out one, but I will for you today.
Right.
There was a Belgian lady, Thérèse de Radiguez, and she worked for one of the British intelligence networks, as so many thousands of Belgians did in the First World War. She was 49 years old, and she runs a whole section of intelligence gathering in Belgium, and that goes up eventually to British intelligence headquarters. And then, of course, it's shared with the Americans when America comes in the war in 1917. So she's fearsome, and within days of the outbreak of war, she's in the castle. A family live in a castle. The German officers turn up. some of the officers want to live in the castle. They want the keys. And she says, no, you're not having the keys to the castle, but you can stay here. And of course, the soldiers are occupying the stables, etc. She looks after them in a way. The men are fighting on the front line, her men, and the daughters are helping her in the intelligence. But they're running the intelligence network right under the noses of the occupying Germans. And then when it comes to World War II, she's 74 years old in 1939, and she co-founds another intelligence network, the successor to this World War One network, and she's highly influential, of course, as a founder. And then her co-founder, he's called Walter Dewey. He also did the same stuff in World War One. He's actually goes to her house in January 1944 and says, I think you've been betrayed. I think your name has got out there. You've got to leave. And she says, no, I'm not leaving the post. Anyway, the Gestapo turn up. He runs out the back of the house. They have several doors in these houses. And they chase him down the street and they shoot him dead. One of the leaders, the main leader, is dead. Walter Dewey is dead. Therese Rodriguez carries on the network with thousands of others, but she's carted off by the Gestapo. And at this point, in 44, she's 79 years old. She's about to undergo interrogation, and she feigns senile dementia. And
That's amazing.
she kind of pretends she's got dementia and memory loss and all that kind of thing, and she's acting a bit strange. And the Gestapo, the kind of who do the horrific, torture interrogation, were saying to each other, "Well, hang on a minute, she can't possibly be leading an intelligence network. She's not a spy. She doesn't even know where she is. She doesn't even know who she is." And I love it. And you know what? They let her go. They let her go,
Oh
and she
my.
carried on running that network for the Allies. Unbelievable. And there are so many inspirational stories like that of men and women, and I think we have to tell those stories. And now I think perhaps that gives you a little bit of an insight into why I find these stories inspirational. When I stumble across them, I think, oh wow, that's got to go in the book, hasn't it? There's no way you're going to leave that story out of a book. But she's never ever had any recognition, and her daughters did exactly the same.
Wow.
Yeah, incredible.
Her daughters were involved as well.
They were in both world wars, and she actually lost a grandson in a concentration camp because he was working with the Belgian secret army. Yeah, he was 21 years old. So the family did suffer loss. Yeah, and her husband was imprisoned on suspicion of espionage in World War One, but they didn't find any evidence, and he does survive. But extraordinary sacrifice, and I think extraordinary
Yeah,
courage. Unbelievable.
I agree.
I know that sounds absolutely incredible. And it sounds like she's just one of many stories that you cover.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a whole, I mean, it's like an army, I guess, for lack of a better term. All these women or people who are just operating behind the scenes that really did help us, maybe did their part to contribute to the war effort.
Well, I have another story actually in the women in it. Well, I've got lots of stories in the women in intelligence, but
We love it.
some of the women, and they were from all kinds of backgrounds. So they could be, nobility, aristocrats, countesses, that kind of thing. Or they could be from really humble, almost like peasant background, peasant farmers, really quite poor. But the women were fascinating because regardless of their background and their age, they would sit outside their little cottages. If they were quite humble, they'd be sit outside their cottages knitting. Knitting isn't very much what we do today, but I suppose some people crochet, but knitting scarves and jumpers. And what they're doing is they're watching the rail networks. They're watching all the troops being moved by railway, because that's how Germany has to move its troops in World War One, from Germany right across Belgium to France. There's no other way they can do it. So if you look at it, it takes days. The horses, the kitchens, the equipment, the guns, the special, what kind of forces, infantry, and they're coding what they see into their scarves. And then the scarves get chucked over the line, and on the other side into unoccupied parts of France or into neutral Holland, it's picked up, of course, on the other side the farmers know, and it gets taken to intelligence headquarters where some British officer has to decode this scarf. It doesn't look like a coded scarf. No one would know. Oh, it's fabulous. And there are so many stories like that that I think are just incredible. And then you have women working in air intelligence, naval intelligence. They're in charge of
Mhm.
whole sections. They might be based in an office outside London, but they are doing the most incredible analytical work. Sometimes they are heading
Mhm.
up a whole section of personnel. And they had hugely responsible roles, but again, they've just been hidden in
Mhm.
history. And now that the files are beginning to come out, I think you give a deep dive into those and start to pull out the stories. A lot of it's unexpected finds.
Are there more files that we're awaiting or that you're awaiting to come out?
Oh, lots of those.
A
Yeah,
lot still. Wow.
yes, and a lot into the Cold War as well that hasn't come out yet. Probably because it's still too recent history in many ways, even the early Cold War. So a lot of stuff on double agents, atomic spies, but nothing really on the operations that we did. I'm not sure if that's true with the archives in Washington. I hope to use the archives in Washington one day. That would be good.
And how long does it take for these files to become declassified? I know it's decades, but it seems, and forgive me, but like 70, 75 years, it feels like it should be safe to kind of release that information by now, right? Or is there something I'm just not thinking of?
Well, our intelligence service MI6, which is the equivalent of your CIA, never releases its files. It has a blank policy. We aren't giving anybody any files. So we get other files, Foreign Office files, Cabinet files, Prime Minister's files, and some of the War Office files, and some of the MI5, so the security service equivalent to the FBI. They do release files now and again. And it seems quite random to us, and it's about every 5 years, but that's not set in stone. So somebody in MI5 will go through something. Actually, look, this lot here, we can just put this into the National Archives. So there's an awful lot held back. We don't know how much is held back. You can tell sometimes from the gaps in our knowledge that there's possibly material being held back. But there isn't a blanket rule. So MI5, it's not 100 years or 50 years. They could hold on to something forever if they wanted to. So we had a series of very famous murders in the 19th century in London by a guy sort of codenamed Jack the Ripper. No one's
Mhm.
really ever identified him in the East End of London. Now, some of those files are still classified, and it's well over
Oh,
120 years ago. And why?
I didn't
Unbelievable.
know that.
Why
Yeah,
are they still
why?
held back? But I think we do learn as historians on part of this journey that if we can't have those files, there is a very good reason. And there may be something that
Mm,
would compromise a family or methods used,
yes.
although today we're in a very different world. So it can't be that. But there is usually a reason why materials held back. And I think we learn to respect that. In the early days, you get very enthusiastic and you want to solve all the mysteries, a bit like crime drama. You want to solve
Yes.
all those espionage mysteries, and you think if you dig around long enough, you'll find all the answers. But with this history, there's always those gaps. And for me, I think that's part as well as the fascination. I'm not sure in the end of the day that I really want all the answers. I think I like
Yeah.
that mysterious, shadowy world where we don't quite know everything about the CIA or MI6. I'm not sure if our listeners, if our weirdos agree with me, but there's something fascinating, I think, about having that mystery as well.
Yes, so it
Yeah.
sounds like that's why it's appealing is because we can't ever fully know.
I think so. Yes. It takes away some of the mystique, doesn't it? If we know
Yeah.
all of the answers. But who knows? We're just grateful for whatever comes into the archives, because then we
Yeah.
know these are stories we are now allowed to tell.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you're doing a really important job of actually telling those stories, right?
Yeah.
Because I know the work of historians is really difficult because you have to analyze these primary documents, right?
Mm,
That aren't necessarily categorized. They could be all over the place.
yep.
You have to just digest all this data and present it in a way that makes sense. And that's not easy. That is not an easy thing to do, especially when you're not even necessarily sure what exactly you're even looking for.
Well, that's true. I mean, when you do a book proposal, you've got chapter outlines, broad brush. I mean, at the end of the day, there may be a few changes in the chapters as you discover something extraordinary. But broadly speaking, you know roughly what ought to go in the book. So if we look at the women's book, we know roughly what kind of things would go in. So, what did women do behind enemy lines, if anything, in World War One? What did women
Hmm.
do in uniform? What did they do in MI5? What did they do in the Secret Intelligence Service, which today we call MI6? What can we find out around that? And then in the interwar period as well, women working as so-called secretaries out of British embassies
Hmm.
and places like that abroad. So you burrow into the Foreign Office files and you have no idea what you're going to find. Sometimes relatives come and hear you speak at a talk and they'll say, "Oh, my aunt did something really fascinating. She's got a little bit of a secret war. We don't know what it was, but I've got these photographs and maybe you can piece things together." And then for World War II, you're thinking, okay, we've got to have something on the women of MI5, MI6, naval intelligence, behind enemy lines. The women dropped into France. The women dropped into other parts of Europe. What is available? And so you literally have to scout that to find out what's available. But you do get, as I said earlier, this whole theme of accidental finds. And one of them
Hmm.
became a chapter I didn't have in the original book proposal. And that was, I stumbled across this woman who was the only spy swap of the Second World War in currently declassified files. And I thought, no way. I sat there in the archives thinking, no, you're kidding. Because, you have spy swaps of the Cold War. You've got the Glenica Bridge, and
Hmm.
we've all seen Bridge of Spies and those other Cold War, spy films where each side, the Soviets have got one of our spies, one of your pilots, of course, and they could
Right.
walk across at midnight or in the dead of night, and the other spies walking across and they're escorted, and you've done your spy swap. Well, I wasn't aware that there were any spy swaps in World War II, and there's only
Yeah.
one in currently declassified files, so there could be more, but we just don't know. But there is one, and it was a woman. It was a British woman. She must have been so valuable that was swapped for a
Yeah.
German spy. And she went on to do some incredibly brave stuff. I mean, she had a pretty nasty time at the hands of Gestapo, but having had a very dangerous Second World War and having been swapped back to the UK, she wants to do more in the Cold War. She wants to go back. She wants to go behind the Iron Curtain. And they're saying, no, 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 you've gone through an awful lot. Just kind of let's use you for something else. And she's determined. She's, look, I've got the expertise. She goes back behind the Iron Curtain, and she ends up, in the end, she's captured and she spends 9 years in a Soviet prison. And she
Oh
survives.
my God.
No.
She survives. So, I
Oh,
think it probably gives you a flavour for why
Hmm.
I'm fascinated by the stories, but also I think, well, would it be right to say a moral obligation? I think if I've discovered these stories and they are wow like that, and we don't only
Hmm.
tell wow stories, we want to tell the stories in between as well of everyone's
Of course.
contribution, and so that whole tapestry is great. So you know I'm going to keep going because these stories like this are inspirational.
It's your mission, it sounds like.
I suppose you could call it that. Not that I started out like that, but I just love it. I love the research, I love the writing, and also the public enjoy it as well. I give lots of talks, I do podcasts like this, and people love it. They can't get enough of the secret war, and they want to genuinely know what people did in those wars. And so many, have relatives, uncles, great uncles, aunts,
Mhm.
mothers, fathers, grandparents who did something secret. And occasionally they'll find those names in the back of one of my books. And they've had a lifetime of
Mhm.
secrets. And for them, it's almost like a closure, but it's exciting because it helps them to understand and also to feel proud of those relatives. Because if they've worked in intelligence, they go to their grave never speaking about it. They're not allowed to.
Mhm.
Oh
Wow,
my
what
gosh.
beautiful closure, like you said, you give these families, and what a nice byproduct of your work.
Yeah, I suppose
Exactly.
so.
And Helen, what was the name? Sorry, before I
Oh,
forget, what
yeah.
was the name of that spy? That was the World War II spy and then also the Cold War spy.
So she married a Hungarian diplomat, so she became Baroness Miska. So if one
Oh,
Googles her,
Oh
she's
my God.
and she
The
didn't
plot
tell.
thickens.
It does, it thickens. And she doesn't, and she's working out of Istanbul into Austria. Oh, it's fascinating. And all these secret missions. And she doesn't tell her husband, Hungarian diplomat. It's very serious if your wife's, accused of espionage. And she's arrested for spying. And of course, he's like, oh, she's not a spy. But of course she was. And she would sometimes have secret meetings in the embassy when he was out for other meetings. So he was furious on one level, of course, because it compromised him. But
hmm.
yeah, I mean, you're quite right. The plot thickens.
And this was a story, going back to what you said earlier, that you accidentally stumbled upon when researching the book on women in
Yes,
espionage.
yes.
This woman sounds like she could have her own book.
Yeah, she probably could. Yes. Bit more research
And
around to
I'm
fill out her missions and things. Yeah, I'm pretty sure she could. Yeah,
and
I
we
haven't
spoke about this a little bit. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't located any family. I don't know if she has any family.
Mm,
So sometimes that's helpful because they have pictures and sometimes they have personal letters and you can just weave in a few little anecdotal things, which is nice because it makes them real people rather than just
mhm,
sort of dry on the page. And I always work by a sort of, I don't know if you call it a principle, but if I find something fascinating, I think the readers will as well. So when I'm researching and I think, oh, wow, that's interesting. Oh, that's amazing.
Mhm.
You know, and then, or you fill in a little gap and think, oh, that links those two stories. That's great. And I think people will find that interesting. I don't write stuff that's sort of dry, just hard factual. I think it has to have something deeper and have a personal connection so that you as a person can connect
mhm.
to those characters and also form your own judgment about what you think of them. So I don't like to impose too much on them, but just to tell their stories as it is and for the reader to say, oh wow, she was a heroine. Because she wouldn't want to be a heroine. But that's not for me to say, oh my goodness, in the book she was a heroine. But to allow people to form their own judgment about what they perceive as being risky or being exciting. And I think that's just an unconscious part of what I do.
I love that so much.
Yeah, me too.
And I was gonna say earlier, because I had asked you this prior to us recording, and I do want folks to hear. This is something that happens, right? You're researching a book, and then you stumble upon new research, and you think, "Oh, that has to be another book."
Yes.
Um, what does that process look like? Are you ever writing multiple books at once, or do you sort of set things aside and finish the project in front of you? What is your process like?
It depends. So sometimes I've got a book on the go and I'm trying to fill in the gaps. I wrote a book, Spy Master, on one of the greatest British spy masters of the early 20th century, so up until the end of, or into the early Cold War. he had Thomas Kendrick. He was called. He had an American father and a South African mother.
Mm.
He was British spy master for MI6, and that took a long time because filling in the gaps. So while that was going on, I was writing a couple of my other main books until that one was ready, and then I sort of pretty much, I think from memory, focused on particular books within deadlines. But now, and in the early parts of my career, I was writing a few at once and juggling them. Now I've gone back to
Hmm.
doing that again. I'm being forward thinking, and if something's inspired me while I'm doing some other research, I might pull an extra file ready for that second book or whatever. So I'm thinking things through, but they're pretty much around what I've already researched and written. So it's not like I'm
Hmm.
starting totally from scratch.
Right.
Although, that could change as well. So it's not unusual.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask.
So
Could
it's
that
not
change?
unusual. Yeah, it's not unusual to find myself proofreading a book that's coming out in a few months' time, for example, whilst already researching and writing some of the chapters for the one that's coming out after that. Yeah?
Hmm. Wow, that's incredible. Your brain must be amazing because I
Well,
can
I
hardly
don't know.
focus on one thing at a time.
People say to me, well, don't you get the stories mixed up? And I
Hmm.
thought, well, it's a bit like I don't get my sons mixed up. you know, I mean, or if you were making a recipe, if you were making a cake on one side, but you were also cooking, I don't know, casserole on the other, stew, you wouldn't get the ingredients mixed up. Do you know what I mean? And it's a bit like that with a book because people do think aren't you going to get the facts mixed up? But funnily enough, you don't.
I think especially when you're so just passionate about a subject, it's really hard to. So I think I understand where you're coming from, but in order going back to your stew versus casserole, I absolutely would mix those things up. Completely honest, I would mix up ingredients because I'm a terrible cook. So, but yeah, like ancient Greeks versus ancient Romans, I would never mix those up. So I,
Yeah.
I I understand where you're coming from.
And then that brings us to another question we had for you. Obviously, this is an area of history that, like you said, you're not stopping anytime soon. There's so much richness
Mm.
here for you to explore. Is there another era of history that you enjoy studying, even if it's just for fun, for leisure?
Yes. So I do, when I get time to read, I do enjoy Elizabeth I. So we're talking about 500
Mm,
years ago. So that's quite a long way back. I've always been fascinated in the Tudor period. There's a whole Tudor dynasty of the royal family. But I'm beginning to tip a little bit into the Cold War period. So I'm interested in that and I might write a bit on the Cold War. But there's precious little at the moment that's been released. So, but maybe that will
yeah.
change as time goes on and things become less sensitive. Who knows?
Yes, hopefully. And I think it's really interesting you mentioned Tudors and Cold War because those are two things that Stephanie and I both find very fascinating. We both find both subjects fascinating, but Stephanie is very much so a Tudor era person, and I'm much so like now, really starting this year, a very Cold War era person as well. It is fascinating. And you know what, Helen? Actually, if you want, you could go to Washington D.C. and file a of Information Act with Congress, and you might get lucky, and they might release some files for you.
No, that's true.
Yeah, I will try that actually because I'm doing some work on a woman at the moment, and I think there might be some American files on her because there was an American ambassador that was sort of helping her, not in her espionage work, but when
Mm.
she was sentenced to death, he was trying to intervene and save her life. So I can't say any more. But I was going to say, you were saying, Steph, that you like Elizabeth I. Well, I don't know if you're aware, but she was a spy mistress. She had her own intelligence network and she founded her
No.
own organization, yes, that was separate from anything else. And in one of our grand stately homes just outside London, there's a house called Hatfield House. So if any of you visit the UK, It's well worth seeing, one of these grand Tudor-like houses. And it has this huge, absolutely huge portrait of Queen Elizabeth I. I mean, there were lots of paintings done of her, and she's always in these glorious dresses. But this particular one has eyes and ears on it, imprinted on it, embroidered on it. So she's the ultimate
Wow.
spy mistress. Yeah, she headed a network.
Wow.
She got her
That makes sense
courtiers.
because,
Yeah,
yeah, so many people were against her having power. You would kind of need a spy network at your side.
absolutely. And she used, very famously, Walsingham, who was very close to her. But yeah, she was fearful that she might lose her throne. But also, she wanted information from abroad. So she would send,
Hmm.
she had her couriers and those that travelled and would bring back, yeah, intelligence for her. So I love that. So she was probably, well, who knows, but she's probably one of the first spy mistresses, meaning that she founds her own intelligence network and effectively sort of runs it, really. And that's depicted in that dress with the eyes and the ears. There's nothing else like it.
That's
Wow.
incredible. We need to see
That
that.
is so, yeah, we really do. That's amazing. And do you think it was part of the spy network that let her know in advance of like the Spanish Armada? And I mean, luckily,
Yeah.
nature took care of that for her. But yeah, so, oh man, that I can't even, that just gets me giddy. That's so interesting.
Well, you'll be interested to know, actually, I've never talked about this publicly, but I traced my ancestors back about 500 years, and they came over on the Spanish Armada. They were not pirates.
No.
Yeah, they were. They were Moranos from Portugal. Yeah. So it's
That's
just
so
extraordinary. And they
cool.
married local girls and then, of course, assimilated. And that was it. So, and the trading links between parts of the south coast of England. So, yeah, who knows if they ever met, any of my ancestors ever met any of the royal family. I doubt it. But one thing I can
Hmm.
say, I found no evidence that any of them ended up in the Tower of London. That wonderful place.
That's
I
good.
love that place.
Andrew actually
Yes.
has an ancestor that did, right?
Yes. Yeah, he was oh, babe, what is his last name? He was put there by King Henry VIII.
Was
Oh,
Um
it
wow.
Pace?
Pace, yes, Richard Pace. Yes.
Yes.
Amazing.
An ancestor of mine was in the Tower of London, unfortunately. I feel endlessly for him because that does not look like it was
Place
a
to be,
nice place
no.
to be. No.
Yeah, most people didn't survive the Tower of London. They usually lost their head. So I don't know what happened in the
I
case of your
think he went
ancestor.
insane. Yeah, I feel really bad for him now that I'm saying this out loud.
He
Yeah,
lost
it
his
was a
head in one way or another.
yeah, it's a very kind of brutal era, wasn't it? Yeah, very difficult.
Well, Helen, we again want to say thank you so much for joining us. You have two new readers. I know I'm going to make Andrew go to a bookstore with me this weekend. We're going to buy a bunch of your books, we're going to order them. Can you tell folks where they can keep up with you, where they can connect with you if they're interested?
I'm very active on X, so Twitter X. So do
Hmm.
follow me there. A little bit active, more active on Instagram, but not so much as X. You can follow my website, helen-fry.com, so you can look me up there. And all the bookstores, and you can get the books from the bookstores or on places like Amazon. So yes, do look me up and listen to podcasts and follow me on X.
We love it. Thank you so
Amazing.
much.
Yes, Helen, it was such a pleasure speaking with you and meeting you today. I mean, your stories are absolutely incredible. And Stephanie's right. We are going on just a mini vacation tomorrow. And I know that one of the things that we'll be doing is going to a bookstore.
Yeah,
So, and we will be like on the lookout for your book because I know this is not something we want to wait for. We need some instant gratification on these stories.
Oh, fabulous. And well, I've uncovered some, involvement of American intelligence working with the British as well. So there is a lot of sort of American material in there that hasn't been discovered before. Now that's important. So I think you'll enjoy it. Yeah.
ooh, we can't wait. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And weirdos, thank you for listening.
Until next time, weirdos.